Glaze is nothing more than a suspension of minerals and certain other elements that are used to coat bisque-fired ceramics, and when those elements are heated at a very high temperature, they melt because there's a fine material called silica in the suspension that turns it into smooth glass. First things first, though, we need to start with sanding, and sanding is a double-edged sword. You can use it to sand off really sharp edges that are left over from the bisque firing, but the problem is it leaves a fine layer of dust over your piece as well that you will need to wash off or wipe off with a damp paper towel in order for your glaze to stick. So be prudent with your sanding. Don't just go really hard with that right off the bat. The next thing we have to do is we have to pick our glaze tile. We have a series of tiles at the back of the room that you guys will have to look through, and on the back of each tile is a series of numbers. The top number, weirdly enough, is the base coat, and I put 2 layers of that color on there, and the bottom number is the top coat, 2 layers of that, and I applied it very liberally, and each of these numbers coordinate to the second shelf glazes at the back of the room, and they look like this. Each number coordinates to a different type, and as you can see, olive green is 8, and green float is 5. So we're going to do 2 layers of olive green on the bottom, and then 2 layers of green float on top. You have to shake these vigorously, like so hard, but don't trust the person who had it before you. So always keep a finger or some part of your hand on the lid to keep it shut while you shake it. Again, some people don't close those lids entirely. That would be the worst thing ever if you started shaking it and it got all over you. It will come out of your clothes though. Some glazes have a consistency of more of a mayonnaise, and some are a little more watery and paint-like. Either way, they'll still work. And these are the brushes that you guys will use for the glazing, and these are very special natural hair brushes. You can see we have different sizes. On the left, we have a round small brush. In the middle, we have a flat squarish size, and the right is the fan brush, and these are the ones that you're going to use the most often, especially for heavy coverage. But every brush has a certain quality to it that you need to take care of. These are expensive. So the top part, we have the bristles. The metal part is called the ferrule, and then of course we have the handle. The ferrule is what we're talking about for a second here. The metal part, if you get glaze stuck up in that ferrule because you jam your bristles down into that glaze and it goes past the end of the bristles. See, this is a good depth here. That's good. But if you dip it too far, stop what you're doing, go wash the brush immediately. Packing glaze into that ferrule will ruin the brush very, very quickly. Don't do it. But then once you're ready to start glazing, just take that fan brush and apply it liberally, and I mean liberally, don't skimp on this, to the outside of your piece, but not to any part of the piece that is going to touch the kiln, because again, that glaze is going to melt and turn to glass, and then it'll stick to my kiln shelf if it's on the bottom, and you will have to chisel it off with a hammer. So be careful. But again, glaze it liberally. It will start to dry up very, very quickly, especially for the first and second coats. So I'm kind of getting a little close to my foot there. I get a little bit on it, but that's okay because later I can sand it off. You just don't want to get a lot on there. The less you have to sand off later, the better. See, that side is already dried, so I'm going to go back in with my brush. You need to keep track of how many coats you've done of your glaze. Please keep track of that. If you lose track, you can either apply too much, in which case the glaze will crawl during firing and look funny. And if you place too little, it won't show up after firing at all. And here's an example of me shoving that so far that it gets into the ferrule. Okay, we don't want that. If this happens to you, go to the sink, use the soap and water, and wash it out as carefully as you can, but don't damage the bristles. I'm gonna get another brush, dip it the right way, and I'm gonna start filling the inside. Depending on how loose the glaze is, if you have a closed vessel like this pinch pot or the coil pot later on, you can technically just pour that in there and swirl it around and then dump the excess back out into the glaze jar. So something to consider there. Now notice that I flip it over and begin to glaze the underside and the space in between the ring of the foot. That's because that space is sunken past the foot, it won't touch the kiln shelf, so you can glaze it. Just not that ring that will touch the kiln shelf, so be careful. As you start getting heavy with your coats and you get up into like layer 2 and layer 3 and whatnot, you'll notice that the drying time starts to lengthen. First and second coats go quickly. They get absorbed into that clay and they dry very fast. And I have a time lapse here of the drying process for this. It took about 30 minutes for this third coat to dry. As you can see, it's getting lighter and more chalky looking. Now, it won't be this color when it's fired. That's okay. It'll fire to what is on that tile that you looked at when you picked the colors. So don't despair if that's you. So once it's kind of dry, it'll be dry to the touch, then you can start putting your next coat on. You never want to put on another coat when it's still wet because you'll smear the coat underneath and then it won't be even application, which is not good. So don't do that. Be patient. So again, finger on the top of the lid. I'm going to shake green float vigorously, and I do it off screen because I really had to shake that one pretty hard. And if your glaze doesn't want to shake properly, let me know. It might need a little bit of rehydration, and I can do that for you really quick. So then we start with our second coats of green float on top of the olive green. And if you have little crevices or edges that need careful application, or like those scales in there, just shove the bristles in there. Don't damage the brush. It doesn't take a lot of pressure, but just get a lot of glaze on your brush and poke it in there. Fill everything. Now you want to get pretty close to the base, but not too close to the base, because glaze, as it melts, it's like melting cheese. It'll start to drip, or as we call it, crawl. It'll start to crawl down the side of the vessel, and in which case you might not have anything on the foot of your vessel, and it still might stick to the kiln shelf if you have either too much glaze or you didn't leave a high enough border around the base. Usually like an eighth, no, not even an eighth of an inch, like a 16th, or yeah, maybe an eighth of an inch close to the base would suffice for this. But if you have a foot, just leave the foot raw and it'll be fine. Be careful handling it when it's wet. It will stick to your fingers and peel off. Be careful. And then again, wait for that to dry. It will take longer. But once all of your coats are dry, just sand the bottom, make sure it's clean, and take it downstairs and you're good to go.